Hello, BookTube. We're down in puppy territory to continue with our bookshelf tour of the Penguin Classic basement, the very bottom shelf of the Penguin Classics wall, where I have stuffed all of the old mass market Penguin paperbacks that I don't anticipate myself ever reading again. I prefer the larger trade paperbacks, or even, if I'm being spoiled, the deluxe paperbacks. And I dream of seeing most of these things, as you've seen in the previous installments of this endless tour. You've seen, I dream of most of these things in that format, either finding them in a big trade paperback that's easier on the eyes, or Penguin using this incredible wealth of back product that they have to make a Penguin Classic Deluxe Edition, maybe a new introduction, new cover art. Who knows what conversations these old things would spark? So we're just gonna continue with a few of those right now. I'm kind of buried here, but we'll see what we have first here, though. Oh, goodness gracious! Oh my! Oh, here, let's do three in a row. This is Livy. This is the Penguin Classic Livy. We've already seen a couple of these. This is the Aubrey de Selincourt translation of the early history of Rome. These were the earliest books of Livy's great life work. He wrote this book for his whole life and gave readings, and it was a big event when a new segment would be finished. All of a sudden, there would be readings all over town. There'd be samizdat copies that would circulate from the bookstores. And the early history of Rome is the mytho-history. It's the time of the earliest settlement, the legend of Romulus and Remus, the ancient kings of Rome, who were so tyrannical that, according to Roman mytho-history, they were so tyrannical that the freedom-loving Romans drove them out and forever afterwards would not have a king. So that even once their system had changed into an absolute despotism, an absolute singular monarchy that was hereditary in a family line, they wouldn't use the word king. And the one of the Romans who most helped to institutionalize that change, the man who later became known as Augustus, Caesar, insisted in his life that he be referred to as anything but a king. Princeps, first of men, that sort of thing, but not a king, not in Rome. He was perfectly happy to be called other things, including a god, outside of Italy, but not at Rome. And Livy tells a story with just swells of trumpet and fanfare. He goes through the motions. He's actually, in his books, he's actually an approximation of a conscientious historical researcher. I know he doesn't have that reputation anymore. People consider that, there's so much myth and legend and folklore just liberally stewed in with all of the facts he had at his disposal that we can't really trust any of it. I don't think that's true. I've mentioned on this channel in one of my 3,700 videos that I have always maintained that Livy is more trustworthy as a historian than historians tend to think. But books like this don't help any. But then we also have two other volumes. This is Rome and the Mediterranean. Just the ongoing, the continuation of his story of Rome gradually growing in power and reach and trade, eventually consolidating its grip on its half of the Mediterranean coast and just moving on from there. And every step of the way, there were native tribes, there were native tribe coalitions that had to be first approached humbly and then cheated and then warred down until they were nothing but provinces of dependence. And then this great volume, Aubrey de Selincourt's translation of the books of Livy that deal with the Second Punic War. The war with Hannibal. The Second Punic War and the larger-than-life figure of Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who attacked Italy and engaged Roman armies on Roman soil for years. This is a perfect, he is a perfect lightning rod, a perfect combination point of Livy's strengths and weaknesses. The combination point that makes strengths out of his weaknesses, because Hannibal actually was larger than life. And a lot of the stories that come out of that war are probably true. It was just a time for grand gestures and hugely corrupt and also hugely brave people on both sides, and epic military confrontations. This is a terrific Penguin volume. And I'd be willing to bet that the Aubrey de Selincourt translation of The War with Hannibal is not in print anymore. I haven't checked before this video because it would depress me for the whole day. This is a wonderful, wonderful volume to read, like a novel. And it is that despite being something that should outrage all my sense of translating the classics. I've been complaining in these videos liberally that I don't really like a lot of translations of classics, not raining down on Penguin here. I don't. Most people, most publishers, most authors, most scholars' translations from the Latin or the Greek, just they do it for me less and less as time goes on, and my own ear for English becomes sharp enough to see all that's missing and that could be there. And I've mentioned in a few videos that leaves a translator with two choices. Translation has always left translators with two choices. You can either do your best to convey exactly what's there in the original, no matter how thudding or artless or tin-eared the result is in English, or you can take the original, sort of swirl it up in your mind and distill it, its thrust, its facts, its specifics, and especially its essence, into your target language, into the target language of your readers, whether it's English or anything else. And you would think that the second approach would make my worries about translating from the classics even more pronounced, because the second approach has much more capacity for change, for fundamental alteration. And you'd be right. But that's exactly the approach that Aubrey de Selincourt took, and it's like reading Livy, which is the highest praise I can give to a translation, is to tell you it's like reading the original. It's like the translator isn't there at all. Not because it's word for word accurate, but because the feeling is exactly the same. The voice is exactly the same. Aubrey de Selincourt would take a long chunk of the passages in this chunk of Livy. He would take a long chunk of the Latin and maybe write it down in Latin on paper, or study it over for breakfast, and then he would walk around with it in his head all day, sometimes all week, and then he would sit down without consulting the original and write it, and write out what he'd been walking around with. And the result, I don't know how it works, but boy, does it work. I cannot praise it highly enough. Let's see who's next here. Oh, okay. Well, we go from artful Latin. This is A. Handford's translation of the Conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar, written by Julius Caesar, as told by Julius Caesar, starring Julius Caesar, with a special guest starring role by Julius Caesar. Seen the world over for thousands of years as a textbook of classical, pure Latin, brilliant style, brilliant military memoirs of a brilliant military commander, so that even now, 2,000 years later, Julius Caesar is still calling the shots on his own reputation. Gotta read it. If you're interested in classical history, you have to read it. Like I've mentioned on this channel a couple of times, the number of times where a figure as important as Julius Caesar actually writes books that we have and that are readable is infinitesimally small. So if they exist, you have to read them. But nevertheless, you don't have to enjoy them, and trust me, you won't. Let's see what's... Okay, we have two volumes here. We have the History and Topography of Ireland and A Journey Through Wales and a Description of Wales. These are books by Gerald of Wales, a 12th century cleric who knew everybody, knew all the famous people, knew King Henry and Eleanor of Aquitaine and King John and King Richard, and all the literary people of what is now the United Kingdom. He knew everybody, and wrote all the time. The Penguin did these two volumes. I think they might have done one other volume, but he wrote all the time. He wrote for his whole life. In fact, he was in holy order, so his food and board was provided. But had they not been, and had anything like our current commission system, royalty system, copyright system existed, he could easily have supported himself on his writing for his whole life, which is, one of the first times that had happened since the fall of Rome in the West. And he's tremendously good. There's no way I'm going to convince you of that. but he's tremendously good. He's I love him so much that in the old Open Letters Monthly days, I used to take substantial ribbing for enjoying his books as much as I do. But they're wonderful, and he was known. Boy, oh boy, was he known. If you were, an olive merchant or a wine merchant or the castellan of a city, and you were traveling on vacation to your wife's family or something like that, and you had a couple of books in your saddlebag, and you got to a sizable town, one of the first things you would ask at the local monastery or wherever would be whether or not they had anything by Gerald of Wales that you hadn't read. And so he was that kind of author. And we don't think about that. We don't think those kinds of authors existed in the Middle Ages, but they did. He was the foremost example of them. The primary literary man of his day in the West in his time, completely forgotten now. I'm 100% sure that Penguin doesn't print Gerald of Wales anymore. And they should. In fact, many of his books were very short by our standards, so you could easily do a big fat volume called Gerald of Wales and just print, half a dozen of his books. Ooh, you'd make Steve happy. And it's about time that Penguin Classics understood what I trust the rest of BookTube understands, which is that the most important thing in the world is, say it with me now, to make Steve happy. Okay. Let's see what this next one is. Oh, this is Penguin Classic Collection. I've mentioned Penguin they do straight up translations like Gerald of Wales or Caesar or Cicero or whatever, but they also have always done collections, collected volumes, where you get where there's curating going on. You have an introduction, you have notes, but the books are brought together, the selections are brought together with an editorial vision. I love them. I absolutely love Penguin collections. They still make them. We just saw the Penguin Book of Hell, and there are plenty of others. And this is some of the very earliest Western examples of literary criticism, my own profession. This has we'll have Aristotle on the selection of his poetics, and it has On the Sublime, credited to Longinus, but it also has Ars Poetica by Horace, by the great Horace. And Ars Poetica is an incredible book. It's an incredible book. It stands alone as a readable, enjoyable, lively, opinionated assessment of literature and a scheme for assessing literature. It stands alone for 15 centuries until roughly the Shakespearean era, when a certain someone wrote another book that was, no. No. The Art of Posy? No. All right, well, it doesn't matter. We'll get to him in time. For now, you can probably download free a copy, a bad maybe English language translation of the Ars Poetica by Horace. And if you can, you should, because it might interest you. And of course, there's always the possibility that we could crowdfund a translation of the Ars Poetica by yours truly with a new introduction and new notes. I'm thinking if you all get together and chip in, I'm thinking that if you could pay me $15, I would probably do that. No, actually, I'd do it for free. And wouldn't that be fun? If I did an introduction to the Ars Poetica, a new translation, new notes, and then made it into a little book and put it up for free. Self-published it for free. Wouldn't that be fun? I'll have to think about that. Because, sooner or later, none of you've all been too nice to say it so far, but sooner or later, the response to me saying over and over again, there's no good translation of this, there's no good translation of that, sooner or later the response will be, well, why don't you do it yourself instead of complaining? Oh, what is this next one? Oh, this is the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket by that great ancient Roman author Edgar Allan Poe. No, this is yet another weird example. Last time it was Resurrection by Tolstoy. Another weird example of a contemporary novel in here with all of my oldest friends. I don't know why. And I don't have this. I don't have Arthur Gordon Pym in a trade paperback. It's the Poe novel that nobody knows. It's the Poe novel that isn't really horror, though it has some creepy moments. And that it took him, he poured his heart and soul into it, but nobody knows it, nobody's read it. And that's a shame, because it's really good. And it shows, I think, better than his kitschy horror stuff. It shows what he might have done in his late 50s or 60s. What he might have done if he'd had a settled, normal life as just a successful man of letters. I think he would have branched out enormously, and I think he would have gone in this direction. And we'll never know, of course. Edgar Allan Poe is one of the big what-ifs in all of literature. I think a towering figure whose life went off the rail. His life went off the rails, and there was no one to stop it from doing that. This is a person who, no shame in it. There are plenty of people like that now and then. There's some people who have prodigious talents, but they need the help of other people to keep their lives on the rail. And if they don't have that help, their lives will go off the rail. Now, that might grate against my Jesuit instincts of saying, well, you control yourself. You're responsible for yourself. But it's still true. I don't have to like it for it to be true. It's still true that if Edgar Allan Poe had had what we call today a support system, he would have written for 20 more years. And who knows what masterpieces we would have. Who knows? I myself think there would have been more big adventure stories like this. But I also think, just a suspicion of mine, from his letters, from some of his essays, I also think he would have written a great work of slavery. I think he would have written, for instance, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, it's a landmark in American literature. It's an incredibly important book. Gave rise to an apocryphal line from Abraham Lincoln about how you're the little lady whose book started this big war. It's a linchpin in studying the literature of slavery, but it's not a good book. I know that's ex-Catholic completely to say, but it's a boring book to read. It has its defenders, people who swear up and down that it's not, but it is. It's boring to read. I wonder if maybe Edgar Allan Poe might have written the slavery novel that isn't boring to read, the slavery novel that's harrowing to read. There are parts of Uncle Tom's Cabin that are harrowing, but only... Anyway, we'll never know. We'll never know. Because he disappeared for a week, and when he turned up, he was already on death's doorstep, and there was nothing to it. I'm a little partial, because technically, he's the son of Boston. Technically. Not in any planned way. His mother calved while she was here in Boston on a stopover tour. So it was not her plan. It wasn't anybody's plan. But nevertheless, he was born in Boston. We can't really claim him. I know there was a war years ago about what city could claim Edgar Allan Poe. And I facetiously wrote into the newspaper saying, well, of course, he was born in Boston, so there you go. But we can no more claim Edgar Allan Poe than, in my opinion, we can legitimately claim Benjamin Franklin. They might have been born here, but they moved on to other places and made those places their home. So, but now I'm wondering if the next author is also going to be contemporary, because I'm used to these authors. Oh no, okay, no, we're back to the ancient world. This is On the Good Life by Cicero. Yet another one of his philosophical treatises that he wrote in his spare time when he had too much spare time. And it's hard to know which is better. When he had too much spare time, he wrote windy derivative philosophical theories like this, or on friendship, or on the nature of the gods, or whatnot. But when he didn't have spare time, when he was gainfully employed by the state, he used it to undercut the very mechanisms of democracy. So I actually don't know which I prefer. Do you want him to have lots of free time, or don't you? One way or another. Cicero is famous for his prose style, for his Latin, and I agree with that. I could scarcely be a student of Erasmus and not agree with the brilliance of Cicero's Latin. It is incredible. In fact, it doesn't really seem possible at times, and for reasons that it would take a bit of time to explain because of the way that Latin works. It doesn't work like English. So there are things you can do with it that you can't particularly do in English. There are things English can do that Latin can't do, but there are things that Latin can do that are amazing, that English can't do and that English can't simulate, which makes English language translations of his stuff seem just extra pointless to me, unless it's his letters. In his letters, he wasn't going for the big literary effects, so there it's possible. But in all of his big literary treatises, he was. And Latin Latin makes sense more by the ending of words than by the placement of words in sentences, which means you can move the words around to create effects on their own. Quite apart from the beauty of the words you've selected, you can also move the words around to create a kind of Easter egg hunt for the nub at the middle of it that causes sort of it's hard to describe, a coruscating effect where you're reading the sentence, and it's building and it's growing, and you think you know what the key word is going to be, and you're anticipating it and anticipating it, and the author is helping you to anticipate it, and then all of a sudden, in a shimmer, the surrounding parts suddenly change, and they funnel you straight to a different keyword or verb or whatever than you thought it was going to be. And the effect is indescribable. It's amazing, but it cannot be conveyed in English. So anyway, let's move on. Oh, another old friend, a dear old friend. This is my mass market copy of Herodotus. This is an Aubrey de Selincourt translation, and he has a flair for people like Herodotus and Livy, for ancient historians who are more interested in telling you a tale and maybe emphasizing a moral point than they are in being precise. So, for instance, Aubrey de Selincourt translating Tacitus might be a bit weird. I'm sure he'd do an excellent job, but it wouldn't be the same. There would definitely be a mismatch between translator and subject, whereas with Livy, and especially with Herodotus, no, there's no mismatch at all. This is such a wonderful version. And now I wonder, I'm sure that Penguin still makes Herodotus. They have to, because it's a work in school still. But I'm wondering, it's probably a version of the Aubrey de Selincourt translation that's so heavily revised that there's barely any echo of the joie de vivre of the original. I would hate to see that. I'll have to check now that I'm morbidly curious. Okay. We have the Ian Scott Kilvert. This is more Ian Scott Kilvert Plutarch. Remember I said the other day that Penguin and every other publisher has just decided to hack up Plutarch into little bits and pieces and publish him in many volumes. And this is another volume of that. This is The Age of Alexander, which will have Plutarch's Life of Alexander the Great, which is incredible. And I think, if I remember correctly, this has all sorts of other people: Agesilaus, Pelopidas, Dion, Timoleon, Demosthenes. This has a whole bunch of great Greeks and Macedonians and whatnot that are roughly the age of Alexander. Really, the only reason anybody would ever buy this volume, and the only reason anybody would ever read it, would be Plutarch's Life of Alexander the Great, which is very, very good. Not particularly reliable, but very, very good. This next one is really thick, whatever it is. Oh, okay. We saw this already. This is a second copy of Cicero's Letters to Atticus, his friend who went under the name of Atticus. Atticus was his friend, his literary patron, his money bags, his safety net, his trampoline, his access point to the imperial court. He was, and also Atticus was also a man of letters himself, and he and Cicero struck up a correspondence and loved the public performance of it. These letters were published in their lifetime, bit by bit. People talked about their own ongoing correspondence. It was a high-flying thing, but they breathed with life. Yes, the two of them knew that the public, that the world was watching their correspondence, but they played that for what it was worth instead of being artificial. So there are all sorts of stories in here of how to deal with fractious slaves, or clogged up sewer systems, or rabid dogs on the road to your country villa, or ghost stories, whatever. Just Cicero at his most charming. I'm not a big fan of his philosophical treatise. But his letters are him at his most charming. And here we go. Penguin used to do this. Cicero's Letters to his Friends, Volume 1 and Volume 2, could easily be put in a single volume today called Cicero's Letters. Could easily be done. This is Shackleton Bailey, I think. D.R. Shackleton Bailey. Yep. These are both D.R. Shackleton Bailey. They're just letters back and forth. Cicero and his friends. Utterly delightful. Utterly delightful. And also a treasure trove of information about what it was like to live in the time. Just amazing, amazing fun. You don't associate Cicero with fun, but these books are amazing fun. So if you see them, you won't see them, but if you do see them used somewhere, boy oh boy, give it a try. You will feel the centuries just drop away. All of a sudden, you will be writing to Cicero. It's an amazing feeling that he was able to convey. And then, oh goodness gracious. Oh my, okay. Okay, this is four. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 volumes out of 5. Never did get the 5th volume in mass market. This is, for some reason, Penguin decided to call it The Story of the Stone. It's actually The Dream of the Red Chamber. It's an ancient Chinese prose epic that is amazingly good. It draws you right in, it pulls you right in, but I never did have the final volume of this, so I don't know how it ends. I don't know how the Dream of the Red Chamber ends. And I also, once again, this is it for today, but we're going to end as we began and as we continue, which is that I don't know why Penguin doesn't have a Dream of the Red Chamber single volume. Big, fat. They do a big, fat volume of Samuel Richardson's Clarissa. They do a big, fat Penguin Classic Deluxe edition of the Domesday Book that no one's ever going to read. They've done Tale of Genji. Why won't they do this in one big volume? I have no idea. It's an incredibly involving story, mostly involving one idiosyncratic, eccentric family. But it pulls in all kinds of other stuff, all kinds of secondary characters, all of whom have dramatic stories. Just an amazing reading experience. And Penguin has already done the spade work. They already have an English translation. You can fiddle around with that all you want, but the huge work of doing it is already done. I have volumes 1 through 4. I don't have volume 5, and I'd be willing to bet these were briefly reissued in trade paperback. I don't think Penguin publishes this anymore. But when they were issued in trade paperback, I think the first 4 volumes. I think my trade paperbacks are also missing volume 5. Right? So what I really need is a complete set of the Dream of the Red Chamber, and I've resisted getting it or really assiduously looking for it because I kind of want that one volume. I kind of don't want it to be in. It'll probably never happen, but nevertheless. So there we go. That is our latest tour through the Penguin Classic basement. And we still have more to go, believe it or not. I think probably 2 more videos before we're done with this. So I hope you're used to all this tedious book natter, because it's just going to keep going. But I'm going to wrap this up for now. I don't want these videos to be too hideously long. So I'll wrap this up, but I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.